I'd say we're in the process of distorting our naval shipbuilding and our defence budget plans for no good reason. Okay, we might get 8 really good, really capable submarines out of it, but at a huge opportunity cost. $368 billion buys you an awful lot of other kit. There are an awful lot of things that we're not doing when we're buying nuclear-powered submarines instead.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Zoe Hilton, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the first Defence Policy event hosted by the Centre for Independent Studies Energy and Defence team. This event comes at a critical time for Australia. Just today, it was revealed that Russia has been attempting to base several long-range military aircraft out of Indonesia. And this comes just weeks after the Chinese Navy conducted live fire drills in the Tasman Sea with no prior warning. And following last year's US election, our relationship with our strongest ally has become a tad more complicated. Upon being asked about the AUKUS agreement in February, President Trump's response was, "What does that mean?" But when the reporter clarified, Trump was quick to reassure everyone that the US has a very good relationship with Australia. Yet in the following months, the Trump administration slapped a 25% tariff on Australian steel and aluminium and a 10% tariff on all Australian goods entering the US, a move which our Prime Minister labelled entirely unjustified. Now, whether these tariffs are still in place, I couldn't tell you because I haven't checked the news in the last 10 minutes, but that being said, there's been much debate about whether these tariffs are in the US's interest, but the question that we really need to be asking as Australia is what is in our interest? And not just in the international relations and trade policy area, but at a very practical level, what does all of this mean for Australia's Defence Force planning and strategy? So to help answer these very important questions, allow me to introduce you to tonight's first speaker. Sam Roggeveen is the Director of the International Security Program and Lead Editor at the Lowy Institute. He has formerly worked as a Senior Strategic Analyst at our nation's peak intelligence agency, the Australian Office of National Assessments, where his work dealt mainly with North Asian strategic affairs, including nuclear strategy and Asian military forces. Sam also worked on arms control policy in the Department of Foreign Affairs and as an analyst in the Defence Intelligence Organisation. He recently authored The Echidna Strategy, Australia's Search for Power and Peace, which challenges conventional wisdom about Australia's security. Please welcome Sam.
Thank you. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you to Tom and to Aidan and everyone at the Centre for Independent Studies for this opportunity and for making me feel welcome. It's a particular pleasure for me as a CIS Liberty and Society alumnus. That takes me all the way back to the, I think, mid-1990s that I did that, and actually was an event, and it's been an association with the CIS that has shaped my worldview. So I owe a great intellectual debt to the CIS and the people associated with it. Makes it all the more special for me to be here tonight. And I've been asked, of course, as you heard, to speak about whether the US alliance has distorted Australia's defence plans. Now, of course, your answer to that question is going to depend entirely on what you think Australia's defence plans ought to be. And to summarise crudely, there are traditionally 2 schools of thought on that question. One is usually referred to as the Defence of Australia School, and the other as the Forward Defence School. The first one's, and the way to distinguish, again, very crudely, between these 2 schools of thought is with the question, what is the Australian Defence Force for? And the first group, the Defence of Australia School, says the job of the Australian Defence Force is to defend the Australian continent. Simple as that. The second school is slightly more complicated, the Forward Defence School. They say the job of the Australian Defence Force is, in conjunction with our great power ally, to defend the regional order that ensures Australia's security and Australia's defence. Now, I happen to belong in the first school, and I think at the moment, given the advent of the Trump administration, that first school, rhetorically and in substance, has has a bit of an advantage at the moment. It's very hard to see Australia backing its great power ally to defend a rules-based order when that great power is itself intent on destroying that rules-based order. But I would hasten to add that critics like me are not against the alliance, and we are certainly not anti-American. But we certainly do oppose AUKUS, which has become the sort of signature feature of the alliance since 2021. And the simple reason for that opposition is that it draws Australia unnecessarily close to American strategic objectives. And I'm going to focus here purely on the submarines. When you talk to defence officials in Canberra, as I often do, they will hasten to say to you, you know, AUKUS is not just about submarines. And they're right, but my answer to them is always to say, yeah, sure, but it's mainly about submarines. And it is actually mainly about submarines. And the reason that I think the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, American and then British nuclear-powered submarines, draws Australia unnecessarily close to American strategic objectives is that the obvious use case for those submarines is to hem the Chinese Navy in along its coastline in conjunction with an American-led campaign in a war against China over Taiwan, or something that is sparked in the South China Sea, or pick your issue. If you divorce those submarines from the alliance with the United States, they make far less sense. I would say that I'm not talking here about a formal loss of sovereignty. A lot of critics of AUKUS focus on this idea that, well, there are going to be American crews on board, the Americans are going to have control of the maintenance, and therefore they're not truly ours. The government, Richard Marles, has spoken on this subject at length, and I think his protestations are essentially right. Australia will have formal sovereign control of the submarines once we acquire them, at least to the greatest extent possible, and to no less an extent than any other weapon system we buy from the Americans. But although he's right, I think he's also fighting a straw man. The more important problem here is that when you have this capability, it's very hard to not use it when the Americans ask you to. So I think we're used to thinking about defence policy in neat sort of linear terms, where we develop a policy, we buy the kit to implement the policy, and then we implement the policy. But it doesn't always work that way. It can work the other way around. In fact, the kit that you have can actually drive policy. So if we eventually have 8 nuclear-powered submarines in our fleet, as is proposed, then at the moment the balloon goes up and the Americans ask us, well, we need you now, Australia, it's much harder to say no to the Americans than it would be if we didn't have the capability in the first place. And if we have capabilities that are designed purely to defend the Australian continent, as I would advocate for under the Echidna strategy, then the question would never arise. The Americans would never ask us for it because we have no capability to help them defend Taiwan. Now, you might ask yourself, well, what am I so worried about? Under Trump, America's never going to take on China anyway. Trump has no commitment to defending Taiwan and to fighting China. Fine, but if that's your argument, then I'd say we're in the process of distorting our naval shipbuilding and our defence budget plans for no good reason. Okay, we might get 8 really good, really capable submarines out of it, but at a huge opportunity cost. $368 billion buys you an awful lot of other kit. There are an awful lot of things that we're not doing when we're buying nuclear-powered submarines instead. So I would argue whether the US is committed to its place in Asia, whether it's committed to defending Taiwan or not, Australia's the loser here under AUKUS. And the irony is that there was really no need for it. This was our idea. The Americans never asked us to do AUKUS. They were fine with the previous plan. The ANZUS alliance was in rude health before AUKUS was announced. I gave some remarks at Turnbull's forum a couple of weeks ago at the National Press Club, in which I made an analogy with an auction. So imagine Australia was at an auction for the alliance, and the auctioneer had already put the hammer down and said, sold to Australia. And then AUKUS was basically Australia putting its hand up and saying, well, thank you very much, but we'd like to make another bid, a $368 billion bid, when, we'd already won the auction. So I just want to finish with an observation about AUKUS and American politics today. To the best of our knowledge, in the public realm, Australia made its initial AUKUS pitch to the Biden administration in April or May of 2021. And I'll just ask you to reflect on that date for a moment. That's only 2 or 3 months after the 6 January riots and only 2 or 3 months after the end of the Trump administration. So in that period, we suddenly became pretty confident that nothing like Trump's first term would ever be repeated. And in fact, President Biden himself was pretty confident about that himself. I stumbled on a quote the other day. Biden said, "I believe history will look back on 4 years of this president and all he embraces as an aberrant moment in time." He was clearly wrong about that. But we believe that too. We also believed that Trump was aberrant and that Washington would return to normal after the first Trump administration. In fact, so confident were we in that judgment that in April or May of 2021, when the paint was barely dry on the repairs to the US Capitol after the 6 January riots, we proposed the single biggest upgrade to the alliance in its history since 1951. So the question that faces us all right now about the alliance and about AUKUS in particular is whether we should still believe that now, whether we should still be so confident that nothing has changed in Washington. I'll leave it there and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sam. Very interesting to think about those two different schools of defence thought, defending Australia's continent or defending our regional order. So to continue discussing these themes, I would now like to welcome our very own Aidan Morrison. Aiden is the Director of the Energy and Defence Programs at the Centre for Independent Studies. Before joining CIS, Aiden worked in various roles as a data scientist with a particular interest in machine learning and forecasting algorithms. In 2010, he founded Rubber Ducky Defence, an R&D startup focused on small military watercraft and enabling weapon and supply systems. Aiden has provided analysis and commentary on naval warfare and military technology, which has included providing evidence to the Senate Economic Reference Committee's inquiry into naval shipbuilding. Please welcome Aiden.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you very much, Sam. I'd like to start by congratulating Sam on a book, The Echidna Strategy, which I'd highly recommend. Is very good reading. He's outlined something of a comprehensive strategy for Australia's defence and national security. And as someone who's starting out in this space, I'd like to acknowledge that it's really quite an accomplishment to have done that. Defence and national security is a national endeavour. It's a giant rug in which international relations, geography, economics, technology, demographics are all tightly woven. And it's sometimes very difficult to know at which corner of the rug to start pulling or at which corner of the rug to start weaving to build a coherent, proper whole. And so I think that Sam, having contributed, I think one of the cornerstone pieces of that continental defence piece is really quite something. I'll start my remarks with describing something of the vibe of some critiques, merit-worthy or not, that circulate for Sam's work as a way of introducing my alternative take. So the two harshest words you'll hear for Sam's hypothesis is that it's defeatist or anti-American. Now, these are somewhat mangled responses, I think, to Sam's far more nuanced approach. As he argues, the alliance will decline in importance of its own accord, rather than requiring any kind of severance or deliberate break. But it does clearly make the case that America will not choose to or succeed in maintaining the kind of dominance in Asia to which we've become rather accustomed, and that we certainly shouldn't build a defence strategy that's predicated on trying to urge them to attempt to maintain that kind of dominance. And that feels like something of a step backwards from the kind of very forward-leaning, arm-in-arm lockstep approach with America. And I think that triggers a sense of retreat in something of the defence space, where hawkish views and a very strong view of the US alliance are sort of perennially quite fashionable. What I'd like to suggest is that the best Australian national strategy, which doesn't assume any American intent or success to retaining that dominant power status in Asia, is also potentially extremely pro-American. Put simply, we can have a stronger alliance with America with less reliance on America. The US could and should want us to dramatically alter our defence strategy in order to enable them to remain deeply engaged in Asia if that's what they so choose. And what I think is something of a remarkable quirk of physics and economics, that defence force and that posture is the same as what we'd build even if they chose to leave and we knew that they were leaving. Yet somehow our defence establishment seems incapable of having the kind of necessary clear thinking conversation with both our closest ally and, I think, the Australian public. Let me first try to sketch the essence of the problem. Australia has grown comfortable developing a defence force that essentially contributes small, high-end forces near the tip of an American expeditionary spear. This has been somewhat helpful for America in an era where they've directed that spear against non-peer competitors in largely non-essential conflicts anywhere around the world except right on our doorstep. But now, with the rise of China, should America choose to remain engaged in Asia, what they need most from Australia is a secure, well-supplied continent that could support the shaft of an American spear pointed north. That, I believe, is what American hawks should ask for and would ask for if we could find the right language to make it clear that's something that we had on offer. Other people have said similar things. To quote Greg Sheridan, who wrote in The Australian in 2023, "Thus, our ADF is not designed to defend Australia or have any independent strategic effect, but simply to allow us to bid for supplemental niche roles in US operations. The Americans find this modestly useful, we get some alliance brownie points, and we avoid having to think seriously about our own strategic circumstances beyond hoping the Americans will always look after us." Now, this stings, but I broadly agree with Greg's prognosis. Despite a volume of different literature that's been published suggesting that our strategy is something different to that, that is the character of the force that we've ended up with. Now, confronting the reason why we've ended up with that force, I think, stings even more. Sam, in his book, describes the way that US force posture looks in Asia, including the basing levels in places like Korea and Japan, are more likely a consequence of essentially institutional inertia than any strategic or deliberate calculation about what the right level of basing should be. Now, if the US suffers institutional inertia, I think Australia suffers something many times worse than that. In fact, it's my opinion that we are now stumbling along in something no better than an effectively brain-dead intellectual torpor, in which we can essentially not have any sustained discussion that is self-aware and is able to course-correct in response to changes of our environment. And I would actually point to AUKUS, and this is a longer story that can be drawn out in questions perhaps, dramatically discarding a statement about what the right type of submarine was in the face of a major procurement that I think was running off the rails in order to suddenly reverse posture and announce a different procurement altogether is evidence of that kind of irrational, uncoordinated, unself-aware stumbling into disaster in order to self-correct. So I would say the first thing the US alliance has done to degrade or distort Australia's defence is to provide easy cover for this kind of aimless intellectual torpor that besets our defence. It was said, common saying a number of years ago, is that no one ever gets fired for buying IBM. Now today it's just slightly dated because IBM isn't the kind of total incumbent of benchmark computing reliability that it was once. But in any case, one consequence of our alliance with the US is that we are grown extremely used to having a catalogue of IBM, if you like, always on the coffee table. And in the absence of any serious ideas about what Australia's circumstances actually require, our establishment instinctively flicks through to the next most impressive capability in the US arsenal and says, "I want one." And we tend towards the minimal viable portion of the nearest to pinnacle capability that the US has. Now, let me make one important distinction. What I'm saying is not that American equipment is bad. Not at all. In fact, the far sillier thing that tends to follow on from that, 1 minute 2, is after saying, "I want one," instead of placing an order from the catalogue, Defence decides to put the catalogue away and invent some bespoke way of procuring much the same thing from a different supplier or different mode of procurement. What we've ended up doing is Americanizing the force structure, but Australianizing the platforms and equipment in it. What we should be doing is exactly the other way round. We should be Australianising the force structure and buying the best possible, mostly off-the-shelf equipment wherever we can, which is very often American. So as a result, we end up with a force that can do a tiny slice of what a superpower does, which is projecting power. And we often do it in the least cost-effective way, which means we bring to bear the smallest possible slice for our economy. Since the acquisition of the landing helicopter dock ships and the air warfare destroyers, it wouldn't be unreasonable to describe our entire defence force, comprising a brigade and a bit of very well mechanised land forces and about 3 squadrons of combat aircraft, as being something like a single Marine Expeditionary Unit with an escorting carrier group, air wings stuck on land, and conventional submarines that can't keep up with the fleet. Former ASPI Defence and Strategy Director Andrew Davies said in a Twitter post, which I think is quite brilliant, back in October 10th, 2022, speaking of the Australian Defence Force, "It is a beautifully balanced miniature United States Marine Corps. When that expeditionary brigade-sized existential strategic problem presents itself, we'll be golden." Whatever's happening to our north at the moment doesn't look like a brigade-sized Australian expedition will ever solve it. So let's try to settle what the problem is. Australia's problem is one of mimicry. We've quietly become accustomed to a posture that amounts to sending military tribute to the US, sending a tiny slice of the kinds of forces America has to fight alongside American forces far away. In fact, I think it might even be much worse than that. Not only is a tiny element of exquisite expeditionary forces probably not a sufficient military tribute to guarantee the US will remain committed to our defence, but our current approaches of attaining pinnacle US capabilities like US nuclear submarines and ballistic missile defence systems in our current approach suggest that we're descending to becoming a truly dumb ally, merely sending financial tribute towards future systems that our ally probably would bring of their own accord should they choose to remain committed to our defence, and might not send anyway, no matter what we pay for them if they don't. So the challenge is to postulate a more positive alternative, one that doesn't alienate or discourage the US from remaining engaged as they might. And to do this, I think we can take a little bit of a clue from AUKUS and the bits of it that seem to be working. It might be a clue to what the US really values. Bases. Australia is currently spending billions of dollars on submarine bases capable of doing deep maintenance on US nuclear attack submarines, of which there are 49 in service, and they want to bring that number to 66. And to the US, being able to base them in the right part of the world matters far more than whether we can bring another 4 or 8 to that party. It's my contention that Australia's geography matters much more now than the niche forces we're able to bring. Their budget is 20 times ours. We're a nice-to-have ally on expeditions, but if the gloves come off in Asia, we're a need-to-have ally for the strategic depth that we have, being proximate and yet simultaneously removed from the critical choke points that are massively more important to the US should they want to remain and fight in Asia. Now, it'd be silly, of course, to provide the US a doormat to Asia for a fight they may or may not want to have or remain in, and one which we'd be determined to avoid if at all we possibly can. Our first and foremost priority has to be our own defence. But here, there is a very happy alignment of stars. Us defending our own continent to the best of our ability, which is definitely our own interests, happens to suit the US extremely well also. The best thing that we can bring to the US alliance is to be the ally in Asia that doesn't need rescuing, and the ally that can make it much easier to rescue others. We're doing a little bit with US submarine bases, but we're not starting necessarily in the best place. We're building that base in our cost for submarines that one day we might eventually have. But right now, it offers us nothing. We already have air bases, happen to be equipped today with exactly the same aircraft the US Navy and Air Force rely upon. And our defence of the Northern Approach requires that we have a maritime strike capability that is able to be operated even when substantially attacked by an opponent. The only Air Force that matters is that one that survives the 21st century equivalent of a Pearl Harbor type preemptive strike. Now, unfortunately, our brain-dead blunder in defence acquisition is still clutching a copy of the IBM catalogue, reaching for the next minimum increment to the nearest to pinnacle capability, which in this case is not yet fully developed or proven, i.e. integrated air and ballistic missile defence. Now, these are the absolute pinnacle of complexity and cost. These active shoot-the-arrow-down type defences. And there are alternatives, and I think it's broadly acknowledged, not just in Australia, that passive defences, including hardening, are very effective. But there's another passive defence that is even simpler and even better, and almost certainly more effective for us. And that is redundancy. If Australia has one hangar for every plane, an opponent will have exactly 76 targets they need to hit before our entire combat air force is effectively neutralised. If our runways are narrow and only one minimum length, far fewer munitions will take the whole air force out of service temporarily. So just as the shell game works for intercontinental ballistic missiles, the shell game can work for us too, with aircraft hangars, runways, bases, munitions stores, etc. Having twice as many hangars, or 3 times as much, or 4 times as many, is likely to dramatically increase the number of munitions on target that will be required to neutralise Australian maritime strike capability. Now, given Australia's ample landmass, doubling down on redundancy and dispersion with lots of extra runways and hangars and fuel stores would seem to make sense. Australia is undisputably the best in the world at doing one thing, which is moving dirt around the top end. Imagine if moving a bit more dirt could do something really useful to contribute to our national security. Now, in a remarkable synergy, the very same depth and redundancy of Air Force infrastructure that would enable our own Air Force to remain relatively resilient to a very large missile strike would also mean that US forces could, at a moment's notice, take up station on our own landmass. Imagine if the US could unload an entire aircraft carrier wing on one of our air bases and operate it at full tempo the next day. Now, remember, the US aircraft carrier can take nearly 70 combat planes at a stretch. It's a bit less than the entirety of Australian Air Force, but it's something close to doubling our Air Force. They have 11 carriers. Imagine if they could unload 3 or 4. Imagine if they could unload at one base and operate a day or two later at any other base in our continent. All that's required to do that is lots of really boring stuff. Lots of concrete, lots of tarmac, lots of tanks for fuel, lots of pipes. So that's just one suggestion, and we're going to be working very hard to develop more suggestions for a different strategy in Australia. But in summary, I think we need to reinvent the US alliance. Rather than sending a little force far away on the tip of the US spear, we need to reimagine hosting much larger forces here, essentially supporting the shaft of the spear. It requires less page flipping through an impressive catalogue of shiny, expensive platforms, sensors and software. Much more mundane stuff, moving dirt, building roads, pipes or ports. We must stockpile or secure the necessary critical supplies and munitions with depth and redundancy. And luckily for us, it's the same type of depth and redundancy that makes our own defences robust that will also ensure that the US, should they choose to assist us or others in Asia, will find it easy to pivot towards our continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aidan. So should we be Americanizing our force structure and Australianizing our platforms and equipment, or the other way around? Have we gotten everything wrong? Should we be pursuing a stronger alliance with less reliance? To keep reflecting on these themes, we're going to have our next speaker and last speaker, Doug Abdiel. So Doug was assigned to Australia as a Truman Scholar in 2007, completing work at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute on the Regional Assistance Mission to Solomon Islands and the International Force East Timor. As part of the US Marine Corps, he was deployed with Australian forces in Afghanistan and has worked for the last several years in a reserve developing combat capabilities at the joint and service component levels inside the Australian Defence Force. Doug also spent a decade at Google in strategy, operations and sales roles, and at the start of this year, Doug joined Advanced Navigation, a deep tech company manufacturing ultra-sensitive navigation equipment, which is used by the likes of NASA, Lockheed Martin, Airbus and Boeing. He is also chairman of Purpose and Growth, a philanthropic organisation that provides manufacturing, employment, training and development to underserved communities, including refugees and veterans. Please welcome Doug.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here this evening. I married into this sunburnt land, and I have 3 great dual citizen children. So while I am necessarily obliged to say that the views I'm about to state are my own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or the U.S. Marine Corps, I can certainly say without reservation that I have more than a passing academic interest in the security of this country. And I personally believe that what you have built here is remarkable and worth preserving. And not enough airtime is given to how remarkable it is that this has been created this far away from just about everything else. Look, from my perspective, the alliance between the United States and Australia has stood as a cornerstone of Australian strategic policy for nearly a century. Often, this commitment has been underwritten in blood. It goes well back beyond AUKUS and well back beyond the time that Britain underwrote Australia's security all the way back to ANZUS. And it continues to be underwritten today by a strong U.S. Force Posture Agreement, which facilitates enhanced defense collaboration through joint military capacity building, including rotational deployments from my fellow Marines. I hope to explore how Australia doesn't need to choose, similar to what Aiden did. But as a flunky of Hugh White's, I wouldn't deign to cross him, nor would I try to parrot his views as well as others in this room can. I intend to make the case that if Australia doesn't choose in some ways, that regardless of the strategy that Sam and others who are far better qualified than I am to make commentary about Australia's defense strategy should undertake, it will be in a better position both for itself and for the alliance. The cornerstone of achieving enhanced capability for Australia lies in the development of a sovereign defense base. Okay? This refers to Australia's inherent capability to independently access, develop, and control essential goods, services, technologies, and expertise required to meet the defense needs from within its own national borders. This encompasses having domestic control over personnel, components, and overall capabilities that underpin the defense industry. Sovereign capability is not about complete independence in all defense matters, but rather about attaining a level of strategic autonomy in critical areas, thereby reducing vulnerability to external disruptions and ensuring Australia's capacity to act decisively in its own national interests. The benefits of establishing such robust supply chains are manifold. Firstly, it significantly enhances national resilience against increasing risk of disruptions to complex global supply chains caused by geopolitical instability, international conflicts, pandemics, national disasters, or even tariffs. The COVID-19 pandemic vividly illustrates the fragility of relying solely on international sources for essential goods, underscoring the critical need for greater national self-reliance in key sectors, including defense. By developing local capacity, Australia can ensure a more secure and adaptable supply chain, safeguarding its ability to respond effectively to emergencies and maintain defense readiness under challenging global conditions. Secondly, investing in sovereign defense supply chains yields substantial long-term economic advantages for Australia. Retaining defense investment within the country fosters economic growth, stimulates local industries, creates high-value jobs, drives innovation that can spill over into the broader commercial sector. Not only does this strengthen the national economy, but it cultivates a skilled workforce who is essential for technologically advanced defense force capabilities. I will not name the country whose attaché may have said it, but I will try and emulate the way that he said it. I do not know of any country that has built a nuclear capability without a nuclear power plant. While my accent may not be great, I think he has a point. It's very difficult to parse these two components out in the long run. Developing sovereign expertise allows for the creation of cost-effective and innovative solutions specifically designed for the ADF's needs. Finally, it is crucial to understand that the pursuit of sovereign supply chains is not a move towards isolationism, but rather a strategic imperative that ultimately enhances Australia's value and reliability as a committed ally to the United States. A strong domestic defense industry positions Australia as a more effective and dependable partner in collective security and deterrence efforts, contributing more meaningfully to the alliance's overall objectives. While the long-term benefits of onshoring high-technology defense manufacturing in Australia are significant, the endeavor is not without considerable complexities and challenges. One primary hurdle is the issue of high labor costs in Australia compared to many other international manufacturing hubs, which can impact the cost competitiveness of locally produced defense equipment. Australian manufacturers know, I know all too well, the unending rising labor costs at all components of the manufacturing supply chain. It makes it challenging to compete directly with lower cost producers. However, should Australia do this, I believe that it will be able to significantly improve its overall value to the alliance. Reports indicate that currently there are significant shortages of STEM personnel in engineering, mathematics within Australia, particularly in areas like cybersecurity and software engineering. I will reserve my marks for that later. Furthermore, even with successful onshoring efforts, Australia may still face a degree of reliance on international sources for certain highly specialized raw material components, technologies not readily available within the country. Finally, navigating the complex landscape of regulatory and bureaucratic hurdles, including defense export controls, technology sharing restrictions, this will remain a challenge regardless of AUKUS and other future agreements that will take its place or augment it. Despite these considerable hurdles, the long-term rewards of establishing a domestic research and development ecosystem in the defense manufacturing area are potentially transformative for Australia. This includes cultivating a highly skilled and technologically advanced domestic workforce, creating a sustainable talent pipeline for the defense sector, and contributing to broad national capabilities in science and technology. It will also foster the emergence of a more innovative and agile defense industrial base capable of responding to evolving threats and developing cutting-edge technologies specifically tailored to Australia's unique needs. Ultimately, investment in R&D and manufacturing will lead to significantly enhanced national security through a greater degree of self-reliance in production and the maintenance of critical defense assets, reducing dependence on potentially unreliable foreign suppliers in a time of crisis or conflict. This endeavor holds the potential for Australia to evolve into crucially and highly valuable contributor of AUKUS, as well potentially NATO allies. I should also mention that those same NATO allies right now are looking for alternative places to source goods in the face of some tariffs. So if this industry had been created today, there might be a ready market. To illustrate Australia's potential for innovation, I think it's insightful to consider the remarkable success of the mining industry. This sector stands as a major economic contributor to the nation's GDP, playing a vital role in Australia's economic prosperity. Beyond its economic significance, the Australian mining industry has a long and impressive history of embracing innovation and proactively adapting advanced technologies across its operations. As an aside, again, this is probably driven by high labor costs and the need to ensure worker safety. This includes the widespread implementation of automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and sophisticated data analytics to achieve significant improvements in efficiency, worker safety, and environmental sustainability. Australia has emerged as a global leader in the deployment of autonomous mining equipment, developing a willingness to embrace cutting-edge technologies. The industry has also made substantial investments in research and development, positioning itself as a critical driver of global innovation in mining practices. While there are several parallel lessons that can be drawn from the mining industry, I'm going to skip over most of them and say simply, the mining sector is creating equipment that is robust and fault-tolerant in austere conditions, which requires as few human lives to be jeopardized as possible. The defense sector happens to be looking for equipment that is robust and fault-tolerant in austere conditions, which requires as few lives to be jeopardized as humanly possible. Direct dual-use technology from this sector, which already constitutes a large component of Australia's GDP, is a natural competitive advantage that David Ricardo wills us from beyond the grave to look into more thoroughly. Now, regardless of the strategy that Sam and others choose to advocate for, I'm going to make the brief case that there is no country that is a middle power that I can think of that has not seen benefits from investing in its own domestic manufacturing capability. Take a few examples. Sweden undertook armed neutrality. It's avoided formal alliances and made very quiet, continued approaches to NATO up until recently. It remained neutral during the Cold War while remaining strong and militarily prepared through lots of runways that were converted from other pieces of infrastructure in and around the area, as Aiden is advocating for. Switzerland, another middle power. It pushes for a more comprehensive defense strategy, continues to push for neutrality, strong emphasis on self-reliance from its personnel, and has maintained a highly integrated military and civilian workforce that can be called on in the time of need. It also has unique geographic challenges, which could be thought of as somewhat comparable to Australia. Israel. This is more of an innovative self-reliance. While it maintains close cooperation with the United States, it prioritizes the domestic defense industry. It has developed cutting-edge defense technology and often tailored these to its own unique specific threats. It developed the Iron Dome missile defense system to counter short-range rocket attacks, and outside of the Patriot, there's very few other applications that you can point to that combat things as well as they do in that area. Based on some of the threats that Aiden and Sam mentioned, it seems logical that a state the size of Australia should be able to come up with something comparable, should it put its mind to it, for its own longer range threats. Finally, Canada. It has paid more attention to multilateralism, maintained a close alliance with the United States, but pursues its own distinct foreign policy interests. It focuses on peacekeeping, international cooperation, and niche military capabilities. It often aligns with the United States, but maintains independent stances on various international issues and participates actively in multilateral organizations. Australia's pursuit of sovereign defense capabilities is not intended to diminish the paramount importance of its enduring alliance with the United States. In fact, a stronger, more technologically advanced and strategically self-reliant Australia will inevitably become an even more valuable, capable, and dependable ally for the United States in addressing the increasingly complex security challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. The existing foundation of close cooperation between the two nations across a wide spectrum of defense and security activities, including joint military exercises, extensive intelligence sharing agreements, and the growing technology collaboration through AUKUS provides a solid platform for this evolution. By strategically developing sovereign defense capabilities that are specifically tailored to complement the alliance's objectives and address Australia's unique and pressing strategic needs, Australia can effectively navigate the complexities of the current strategic environment while remaining steadfast and a capable and reliable ally. In conclusion, Australia stands at a strategic juncture where it can and should pursue the development of a sovereign defense capability through targeted onshore shoring of high-tech manufacturing and sustained commitment to domestic research and development. This path is not intended as a replacement for the vital alliance with the United States, but rather as a means of strengthening both Australia's national security and its reliability as a capable ally. While significant challenges exist, the potential for long-term rewards for Australia, its allies within the AUKUS framework, and potentially broader allies like NATO, by drawing inspiration from the innovative spirit of its own mining industry and learning valuable lessons from other middle powers, Australia can successfully navigate these coming periods of uncertainty. I'll just leave you with, sometimes, if you can't choose, don't.
Thank you, Doug. It's a very important question of whether we can be following in the footsteps of other countries and investing in our own R&D in defence while also being a good ally. So, to moderate our Q&A session, allowing me to introduce you to our most recent addition to the Energy and Defence team, Jude Blick. Jude is an engineer with experience in quantitative finance. Prior to joining CIS, he spent 6 years at Macquarie Group, focusing mainly on risk and valuation of derivatives across a wide range of commodities and financial products. Take it away, Jude.
Thank you very much for your talks, gentlemen. I feel like we had three very different opinions on the stage, which is really good. I feel like we had a thesis from Sam, an antithesis from Doug, and a synthesis from Aidan. So very nice and neat. I wanted to ask a question first. I'm very curious to hear about all of your thoughts and maybe unpacking some of the stuff on defence industry and the sovereign industrial base that we were talking about. But I actually wanted to start with some comments from Paul Keating, a former Prime Minister of ours who's had some things to say about AUKUS, and just get your take on some of his comments. So he was on the 7:30 report last year arguing that the US is an aggressive ally and they actually make us more likely to end up in a conflict with China, not less, particularly over Taiwan and the US's stated stance on Taiwan. And he's also anti-AUKUS and argues that Australia can very well defend itself without the US's help. Thank you very much. That's kind of his line. And particularly I wanted to bring it down to brass tacks, your assessment of our national capability, our defence capability. I quote, "What are the threats? Invasion comes in an armada. You can see them coming for 10 to 15 days with satellites, and you can sink every one of them on the way over." Your thoughts, gentlemen, on whether or not Australia actually has the capability to do that kind of thing?
Sure. In a nutshell, yes, Australia does have those capabilities. They could stand to be improved. But the essential argument of my book was that the only way to project significant amounts of military force against Australia is to send lots of ships our way. The alternative to that, there is another way, which is that you build lots of bases in our near abroad, whether in the Pacific Islands or on Indonesia. But of course, you have to conquer most of Southeast Asia in order to do that, as the Japanese tried to do in 1941. So short of that, you have to send lots of ships our way. So that means in order to defend Australia, you need to have lots of capability to sink ships. And secondarily, perhaps equally importantly, to shoot down aircraft and missiles. And that ought to be the core of Australia's defence force structure. We waste an awful lot of money doing things other than that, which are not part of the core mission of defending the Australian continent against threats. But if we can shoot down enough aircraft and enough ships, then yes, we raise the price of attacking Australia to levels that are likely to be unacceptable to any great power. We are more than capable of doing that, and we can do it independently. And I would argue we don't even have to spend an awful lot more than we spend now. We just need to spend it differently and better.
Doug, any thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think you'd need to invent an enemy who could bypass the Jindalee system and some of the early warning items that Australia has that just doesn't exist, who could make it through the air-sea gap. It's just not a particularly easy trip to do. And then once you do it, there's saltwater crocodiles and a whole bunch of desert before you make it to anywhere that, Australia has tremendous geographic advantages that have not been overcome, and the laws of physics haven't bent significantly. We can't just sprinkle on a little technology and all of a sudden Australia is invadable.
Not even with AI?
Yeah, yes. I mean, we would be putting the artificial in artificial intelligence if we believed that was possible. So look, I would agree with Sam. I think Australia is more than capable on that. And I would go actually further than your former prime minister to say not only can you see them 10 to 15 days out, you have to see that kind of force building up 10 to 15 years out because those capital ships don't make themselves readily available. I think the only, potentially specious way to do this, given Governor Bligh was the guy who navigated in the Rum Rebellion in a dinghy from Sydney all the way up to Dili, right? There are perishingly few Governor Blighs left who can run a small craft or a series of small crafts across the air-sea gap in such large numbers that it can present a meaningful risk to Australia. Theoretically possible, theoretically able to be done on a lower budget. Practically, I doubt it.
Sure. Aidan, any thoughts?
Look, I broadly agree with the premise based on the advantage of distance. So I think it comes down to raw physics, which won't change anytime soon. It's all a question of concentration versus dispersion. Every interesting problem is in tax transfer, in engineering, in energy systems, in defence too. If you want to move a lot of stuff, you need to put it in big things because the surface area to volume ratio improves. You've got more stuff in the middle. You can carry more fuel, people, equipment, and you have the amount of fuel you need because the surface area increases slower than that. So big things go a long way, period. Doesn't matter whether it's bullets, ships, bombs, tanks, planes, big things are required to go a long way. There's some equivocation about speed and the impact on that too, but basically you need big ships to go a long way. And that makes us, I think, very, very eminently defensible. And so I'd agree with that broad premise. I don't think I agree as easily that we can be confident about it remaining easy and within the current expenditure, just because I think that there are circumstances where the gap closes and the enemy comes closer before we have, if you like, a trigger to kind of immediate build-up and hostilities. And I just sort of like to point out that Japan covered the gap between top of Malaysia, Vietnam, and Port Moresby almost in a bit over 4 months, 4 to 5 months, something like that. So in the time that it takes us to kind of put a ship to sea or something like that, like, all of Southeast Asia was conquered once before. So the gap can close. And there's also kind of, we can't forget as well that in World War II, I mean, poor Yugoslavia didn't have a land border with Germany until they did after the Anschluss, right? So you don't necessarily need hostilities to commence before the gap closes quite a bit too. So just imagining worlds where suddenly there are bases on our very near northern border is not impossible. I just think it is in the circumstance of things that we have to consider. Like, what would it take for a country that is very, very poor and developing to decide to have a dominant, ascendant, very friendly, wealthy country gift them with resources and require a big airbase? It's just not outside the realms of possibility. And so I think that maintaining really, really robust, and again, we're talking about here economic advantage factor and demographic problems of sort of 10 to 20 in the other guy's favour. So we have to be we can't afford to waste anything, I think, and it might take more effort than I'm perhaps inclined to think on our northern borders to keep a really robust defence from that.
Great. I'll open the floor to questions now.
I am not a defence expert in the least, but, I was quite shaken by the Chinese going past Sydney. And I've been to Dansk in Poland and heard about, how Hitler lined the boats up and attacked. And also the news today is shattering. And we're here talking about stuff that, particularly this resupplying the supply chains, like a 20-year job, if you ask me. We haven't got the people. We don't have supply chains. We don't make anything anymore. So, okay, that's out of the picture. The talk is also about us being an ally of the US and us helping them with Taiwan or whatever they decide to do in what we call the Indo-Pacific. What strikes me as just a member of the public is that what we've actually got is a great big country up there that is technologically advanced, a great manufacturer, starting to build smaller things. Granted, your bigger things will go faster, but they've already scoped out the seafloor all around here. They're having a good snoop. The Russians are up there having a go. The Chinese have got lots of friends in the Pacific who owe them a lot of money and time. And I'm not an expert, I'm not in ONA. But I sit here and think, gee, it's great to talk about all this, but we opened with what is a perceived threat. I mean, in reality, can we ever get ourselves together fast enough to take care of this?
Yeah, okay. So a question of urgency for the threats at hand.
Yeah.
I think that we can do quite a few things quite quickly. Munition. There's some things that we've stated that would help a lot, but again, like numbers of munitions on the long range kind of air, maritime denial platforms and sort of stuff. Like we have planes that can fly a long way. We have a fair few planes, but as soon as things heat up, where are they? Do they have enough stuff? So I think there's a lot that we could do. I don't think we are defenseless. I'm not worried about us not having defense. I'm not particularly scared about the a flotilla off the East Coast. I mean, a few missiles would be horrifying to the population, but scares such as that in history are scary, but they don't change the whole country, and missiles don't annihilate a whole country unless they have nuclear warheads. So I think there's a lot we could do. We're in a delicate position, but we're not defenseless yet. I'm not too worried about that.
No, you've painted a far darker picture of Australia's security circumstances than I would paint. Since we're at the Centre for Independent Studies, allow me to play the classical liberal. If foreign nations have designs on Australia, and particularly its natural resources, it's far cheaper to buy them. Invading Australia is a massive enterprise, incredibly costly and incredibly difficult, far greater than any rewards you could hope to get at the end of it.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, just asked to ask, what can we learn from Ukraine, particularly in the area of cost-effective drone technology?
I can take that one a bit. Look, my observation is that defense procurement here has tried to economize, and not illogically so, by leaning on defense procurement in the United States and the US to do the initial shakedown tests of most equipment and then try and bring it back. And that looks like a commercial off-the-shelf purchase. And oftentimes things like what we call the LAV 25s or what you guys call the ASLAVs, which are all made by the Canadians, it turns out to be a good piece of kit, reasonable value for money in that area. In the elements of drone warfare, the evolution has been so fast that conventional shakedown model for bigger platforms is not as easily applicable. You can see the primes putting their minimum bid size in on these platforms at $60,000, $70,000, and the Ukrainians kind of laughing, like, look, I can go to the equivalent of JCAR Electronics and rig up something that does the same thing for a couple $100, and do it well, if we're honest. I think there have been some attempts from ASCA, from DIU to try and accelerate that development. I think there is broadly a recognition that it's not fast enough, and it is hampered by the inability now to use Ukraine as a test bed for that area. But I think some soul searching does need to happen inside of Australia about whether or not it is possible to do more of that domestically. For instance, ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, holds very tightly to the electromagnetic spectrum in Australia. And despite you having all this open area throughout the country, almost none of it is used to test electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing of any sort. When that needs to be done, in my civilian capacity, when that needs to be done, you have to send stuff from Australia to the United States to get that done, or send it to Ukraine, because it can't be done here. Because we're so worried that some, rancher on some cattle station out in the middle of nowhere is going to lose cellular phone reception that he doesn't have to begin with for like 2 seconds. It's like, again, you're inventing a world in which this is a problem. So I think there are things that Australia could do with its space to more rapidly develop kit, but it's going to require a little less intervention from non-defense organizations to give defense the ability to rapidly develop those kinds of things.
Aidan, you might want to comment on the themes of warfare and big versus small things.
Yeah,
before
sure.
we move to the next.
That's right. I think that drone warfare is an exciting space, but I think it's hopelessly, utterly conflated different concepts. And I really hate the word drone right now, because people take it to mean different things. And the literal meaning is that it's generally automated, or there's not a person involved, there's not a human pilot. But in practice, the innovations that are associated with it usually to do with scale or speed. We've made something smaller or slower, and therefore are doing different types of missions, and has nothing to do with taking the person off it. So drone warfare in terms of the very small unmanned things. I think it's been a huge flourishing of different innovative things, and I think around the issues of surveillance, in particular, finding places and imposing some threat, dropping a grenade and so on. It's a huge innovation, but it hasn't rendered anything obsolete. It's only a case of and this, and here's another thing to think about. Infantry are still required, tanks are still required, artillery is still required. You have to do a few extra things to sort of ensure their safety. But I think that drones will find niche roles that are extremely valuable, and a whole bunch of other experiments, once the countervailing technologies in jamming or shooting them down effectively have matured, they won't be as big as plenty of other hypers have made them out to be. So drones are not efficient ways of delivering a large payload if they've got multiple different spinning wings. It's just not efficient, or the very small ones that fly slowly can be shot down other ways. I think it's remarkable that Australia or the Ukrainians yet to figure out a gun pod with a nicely off-bore sight cannon to shoot down the drones, because at the moment you can't shoot them down without risking flying through the debris. But we have planes that can keep up with or overtake all the drones and the sort of slow kind of Iranian drones. And so the problem has been the cost-effective response to the drones, but I think that's just things that will have to be evolved. And I think that drones are sort of somewhat on the hype curve, on a downward trend, even after Ukraine.
I would just quickly say about Ukraine generally that one of the important lessons is what strategists call defensive dominance, and drones are a big part of this. Defensive dominance, it simply means that it's much harder and more expensive to attack than it is to defend. That clearly applies on land in Ukraine, where the old metric that you need a sort of 3-to-1 advantage to advance and to take territory, well, that may be 5 or 6-to-1 now in the case of Russia and Ukraine. It's certainly true in the air, where neither side now dares to fly aircraft over the other's territory. They just lob weapons from safely inside their own airspace. And I think most clearly it's true in the naval domain. Ukraine is winning the naval war, and it doesn't have a navy. And it's partly because of drones.
Sorry, I not to disagree with my fellow panelists, just one last thing while we're throwing out blithe remarks about things. To quote Stalin, quantity has a quality all of its own. And if you can produce enough of these one-way drones, right, which start to look like the old, nothing new under the sun, the old V1s that were thrown across the channel in the Blitz, and you can produce enough of them, you can create an advantage in numbers that can overcome some of the defensive issues that we've got on procurement. That's the only rejoinder I'd like to make.
One question back here, and then we'll come to you, David.
My question's to Sam. We actually studied your work over the weekend at the CIS Liberty and Society Conference. And one of the questions that I have arising out of that is, would you say, in the instance of the United States, that their defensive strategy should focus on the protection of their geographic and sort of national interest alone? And I guess my flow on from that is, wouldn't the implication of that be that it was incorrect, or perhaps not correct for them to go as far as they did to be participating in the Second World War, to the extent of defeating totally Nazi Germany in continental Europe and in the Pacific, Imperial Japan?
Well, first of all, I don't know whether to be delighted about the fact that you studied my book at the Liberty and Society, or to be offended at the fact that I wasn't actually invited to go along to defend the book at CIS on the weekend. But thank you very much. That's given my own history with CSIS that I mentioned. That's really that's made my day. Thank you very much. You ask an excellent question. So the answer to your question can be summarized in 2 words: nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons didn't exist when the United States got involved in the Second World War. And that, I think, largely explains why the United States was justified in its involvement and is slightly less justified in playing a similar role in the world today. At the time of the Second World War, and even afterwards, until perhaps the early 1960s, the United States had a realistic fear that a single foreign power would dominate the Eurasian landmass. That is to say, what Mackinder used to call the world island, right? So, of course, in the Second World War, it was Germany and Japan together. And then after the Second World War, there was a fear that the Russians with the Chinese could do the same job. And if any foreign power dominated the Eurasian landmass in that way, then America was an existential threat. The United States was an existential threat. Nuclear weapons largely removed that threat. But I think by the time nuclear weapons emerged in that decisive way, the US was so fully committed that there wasn't really a strong incentive for the United States to pull away decisively, and its commitment to Europe and to fighting the Soviet Union was maintained for the entirety of the Cold War. It's quite natural, of course, that nations would think again about their world role in the aftermath of the Cold War. And it's taken 30-odd years for that to happen, but it's now finally happening. And the reason it's happening is, I think, China. There was no strong incentive for the US to entirely revise its global security posture after the end of the Cold War because it didn't really cost them that much. And there was no force to push the United States out of Asia or out of Europe. It was quite affordable. And in fact, allies supported it with their own funds. Now, of course, the job is much harder, and China is asking much bigger questions of the United States than it's ever had to ask before. And the Americans are now faced with the question, well, is it worth it? Is it actually a core national security interest for us that China not be the leading power in Asia? And ultimately, I think the Americans are already saying, no, it's really not worth it. To take on China is a massive task. And a massive task like that requires a really good reason, an existential reason. And I don't think that reason exists.
We'll go over here just now, yeah.
Thanks. Sam, you mentioned the budget for the subs of like $386 billion, which actually, when that came out, I sort of benchmarked that to the Apollo program. It's like 1.5 times what the U.S. spent on Apollo. Inflation adjusted. It's a shitload of money, right? But I wanted to ask if you guys actually agree, if you and Aiden agree, because you mentioned that money could be spent in better ways to more appropriately enhance our security. And I think Aiden made a point for some ways that money could be spent, effectively turning Australia into a much bigger Hawaii, far closer to the Asia-Pacific region, essentially an aircraft carrier in the Southern Pacific. Would you agree with that focus for that expenditure, or would you do something else?
I'll be very brief, and then I'll let Aiden speak. So I think, based on what Aiden just said in his opening remarks, we agree on an awful lot. The main difference between us is, I think, on the question of where Aiden describes how we best serve the alliance, and he makes an elegant argument. But I think what's hard to escape from Aiden's argument is that for all of the effort we would put into dispersal and hardening and so on, that would still be in service of an alliance that makes us a bigger target. And my argument is simply that we don't need to make that kind of sacrifice. Nobody asked us to do that. And it's hard to get away from the fact that, as someone joked, AUKUS is designed to protect us from the security problems created by AUKUS, right? So if we didn't have these forces, the American forces in HMAS Sterling, the bomber base in HMAS Tyndall, for instance, and we didn't have the AUKUS submarines of our own, it's hard to imagine circumstances in which China would ever attack us at all.
I think I do have a slightly different take. I think that we can imagine circumstances where, because of our own bases already, we get drawn into a conflict. China attacking us out of the blue. It's not that. I hope they wouldn't do that. But history has a way of creating odd things, and people miscalculate a whole bunch. Like, Hitler couldn't imagine a circumstance where Winston Churchill would declare war on the invasion of Poland, and they did. So I just think that we need to probably step one step away from what we think is likely and kind of focus on whether we can really rule something off the spectrum of kind of, do we need to consider this? Because sometimes those circumstances have such profoundly high consequences that you still need to kind of, it has to be almost impossible for you to not consider preparing for them. And I just think that the risk of miscalculation in some future American administration, some future China administration, we could be drawn into an all-out conflict and we should avoid it, probably, but I think that it's something we can't rule out and we can't claim for sure. On the question of the submarines, though, I think I do have a somewhat different position to Sam. I love nuclear submarines because nuclear energy, sort of 1 million times denser or more than any other fuel type, does have profound advantages, and the speed is a huge tactical advantage. In almost every respect, they are better for a given task than an equivalent diesel-electric submarine. So they're extremely good, but they're not always good value for all tasks equally. And in the case of blocking choke points, I also love diesel-electric submarines, and I think that they're very good at that, and that's an important task for Australia. So I do not dislike AUKUS. I do not like the ambition in the longer term to obtain nuclear submarines. But I'm an optimist about Australian industrial capability. I think in the long term, I studied a bit of nuclear physics, by the way, at university. I kind of, can imagine how to build a nuclear reactor or a bomb if you ask me to. Like, it's sort of, I don't think that these things are impossible. I think this is stuff that Australia has a smart population that can do. But what frustrates me is that we've lent on AUKUS as being a solution to a retiring capability, and I think that it is not that. It is not something we can move too quickly to replace the current boats. It is not necessarily a better value proposal for blocking choke points in the Indonesian archipelago. They would still be very good. The best thing that we could do, I think we have a better case than almost any country to have both in the fleet, although it's a massive sort of increase in sort of overall expenditure. And I think the very best we can do is to work out how to use them in tandem to help the nuclear submarines tow our diesel electrics into theatre, which sounds wacky, but I've never heard a reason, I know you're laughing, David, why the technical objections could not be overcome given what people have done in war. I think that it is just it's a match too good to be true. I think the diesel and the nuclear together. So that's a genuine force multiplier, a serious proposition that we should consider, but not in a hurry. And at the moment, we need to replace our diesel-electric submarines for the core purpose of blocking the choke points in the Indonesian archipelago, and we should do that straight away.
David?
Yeah, I'll leave the point of towing submarines with submarines to another time. I just wouldn't be a volunteer to be on either of them. One very short statement and then the question. I'll pose the question first, which is going to be one for Sam. If we only had conventional submarines, how and exactly where would you propose to use those boats, bearing in mind that crocodiles in the moat strategy has never worked historically? The small statement is to say that, and tonight is a little bit of an example of that, until we've got a decent-sized defence budget in the circumstances, there's a strong element of rearranging the deck chairs here.
Well, I assume your historical basis for that claim is composed of wars that have been fought and then lost. It doesn't include wars that have never been fought at all. So you could argue it's worked pretty well for Australia so far in the number of wars we haven't fought. What would I use the diesel submarines for? Well, Kim Beazley a few years ago gave an interview in which he said one of his regrets when he was Defence Minister and he was responsible for the Collins project, one of his regrets was that he ordered 6 and he should have ordered 8. And the reason to order 8 was that then you could block the 3 major choke points in the Indonesian archipelago. And that's essentially what I would do too. Yeah. Like I said, the only way to project significant amounts of military force against Australia is with lots of big ships. And what submarines do incredibly well is sink ships. So that's what you would want them to do. And keep in mind, I use this example in my book. The Argentinians at the time of the Falklands War only had 2 submarines, and one of them was effectively knocked out in the first days. And yet, for the remainder of that campaign, the mere thought prospect of that single Argentinian submarine caused a massive distortion of the British campaign against Argentina and a huge allocation of scarce resources by the British task force. That Argentinian submarine didn't sink a single British ship in that task force, but was an incredibly effective weapon.
We are running out of time, so we'll just take one final question from you.
Yeah, if I can slip two in, it'd be nice. The first one is much talk of invasion of Australia, almost no talk of the concept of sphere of influence. In other words, that our greatest frail or fragility, in fact, lies not in the possibility of invasion, which I agree is almost totally improbable, if not totally, very nearly. Our real problem is that as a country of our type, where we are, we're immensely dependent on export and import. We're dependent on a number of other factors which involve going across oceans or over through the air. And the best way to get us to do what someone else wants us to do, which is the purpose of invasion, by the way, is simply to make all of that very difficult. And the sort of defence that's been discussed so far, by and large, doesn't take that into account. To me, that's the much more probable event, as indeed is the probable fate of Formosa or Taiwan, depending. So one question, how much of what's been said takes into account the fact that we're not necessarily going to defend our continent, but we are in fact going to be subjected to pressures that create what amounts to a sphere of influence from China. The second is that there's almost no discussion about how we arrive at defence policies. To me, and I do follow these things somewhat, it's one of the most opaque processes I can imagine. I've had some peripheral, for a short period, some peripheral insight into small parts of it, and it was to describe it as a jungle. It's not a jungle. It's some sort of jellyfish. Now, nobody seems to be demanding now that we set up a proper, transparent method of arriving at defence policy integrated into our foreign relations policies. Other countries, by and large, the major countries, do this effectively. We seem not to do it. Why don't we spend a significant amount of time working out how we should do it and then do it?
I can be very quick. On the first question about Australia's dependency on international trade, I do take account of it in my analysis, but mainly to dismiss it. Because I don't think that's a serious threat to Australia's security. First of all, because it's so incredibly difficult to do. Again, we are blessed by geography. Australia is so large and we have ports all around the country that trying to block them all in some way or interrupt them all is virtually impossible, or at least so costly that it's not worth it for anything you'd gain. And secondly, even if you could do it, since we were having a historical discussion earlier, I defy you to point me to a historical example where it's worked, where actually blocking imports and exports from a country has succeeded in forcing that country to make major policy concessions. I don't think there are many examples of that kind. On the second point about transparency in Australian defence policy making, I mean, this is a lamentable issue, and I would only say to you, if you're ever in Canberra and you meet a defence journalist, ask them, how do you find out about what's happening in Australian defence policy? And their answer is always, ask the Americans.
I'm not going to touch that second one with a 10-foot pole. On the first notion, I think it's interesting that you talk about the specter of a submarine influencing the British campaign in the Falklands, but don't bring up the World War I example of trying to escort convoys across the North Atlantic. If it's a bit of a straw man to say we're trying to block every port, I don't think you need to block every port. It's just raising the cost to such a level that it's intolerable for someone to continue. I mean, we are in an economics area. We're not, we're just talking about raising the marginal cost of the good. So I think some thought does need, some serious consideration needs to be given to the first question. What that looks like, that is, I think, a different one. But I'm not so quick to dismiss it as a point. And to go back and read old, boring books like Alfred Thayer Mahan and say that the strategic problem that Australia faces is not too different than the one that Britain faced when it had such distended lines of communication and need to develop a Royal Navy that was able to project power abroad, not for its own sake, but for the preservation of its own economic interests. So I think it shouldn't be dismissed out of hand. On the matter of defense policy formulation, I would only point from my perspective to the number of reviews that happen relative to what other countries seem to get by with. Like just about the time you get something settled, it's like, oh, we've got to stop because we're going to have another review. And then you can't do anything because the review is going on. And then you got to wait for the announcement. And then eventually, and then we got to wait for that to get and then by the time you again get a little head, the whole thing starts again. It's remarkable to me the amount of intellectual energy that goes into looking at the same continent and coming up with different results. That's all.
I can't. I'd love to respond to that first one, but on the second one, just briefly, I think that the non-transparency is indefensible, and I think there is an absolute intellectual torpor. I would say intellectual cowardice even. I think that defence is incapable of basically pulling the trigger and killing or challenging bad ideas in their own ranks. There is just everything is good, everything's okay, all of the above kind of bumbles along. Reminds me of a time when I was learning to be a barista, and I had another senior barista who was pouring the milk from a massive jug, and I was passing the jug to the second person who was pouring the milk, and he was asked, "Is that skinny or fat milk? So I can pour the right coffees?" And he looked up and smiled and said, "It's skinny, it's fat, it's delicious." And I think that in defence at the moment, something like AUKUS, an example of just not making a decision. Like it's both the short-term fix and the long-term strategic acquisition. It's both the American thing and the Australian made, and it's the evidence of just never making actually a decision that you end up with every possible patch and excuse put on top. So it's indefensible. But the question of sea lines and communication, which I think is a really important one, I think I tentatively agree more with Doug here. I think that Australia is a very defensible country because ships are so damn easy to sink, basically. I think defending our sea lines is actually more challenging because ships are so damn easy to sink. I'm really worried particularly about underwater. So that said, ships are easy to sink. There's one thing that might rival how extremely easy ships are to sink, and that is how big and empty the oceans are, particularly around our southern approaches. And so I think that Australia's defence strategy, and again, we're proposing to do some work here at CIS to start to quantify this, is that if we don't need any shipping to go anywhere near Asia, defending the ships that come from very distant approaches might not be too hard at all until you get to a port. And I don't think that the task is going to be to block all ports. Goods don't move once they land immediately all around the country either. So I think that the task will be figuring out which port you can render really, really, really safe and sanitized from submarines and very advanced sea mines lurking in the area. And that will require quite a bit of effort potentially to be able to really ensure that we can sanitize that. So you probably know a lot more about some of the classified analyses of that, but I think that the high-level numbers and efforts required, I think, can be approached from open sources. I hope that's something that's worthwhile doing.
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.